Thank you, Chairman Kelly and Ranking Member Schneider, and to thank you to all four of you witnesses for being here today. I've been acutely concerned with the actions taken by the OECD and the Biden administration's failure to protect American interests over the course of the past several years. I traveled to the OECD with Chairman Smith and my colleagues last summer to tell these unelected globalist bureaucrats that they are going down the wrong path and the U.S. tax base is not a piggy bank for Europe's socialist policies. These failed negotiations have left the United States in a much worse place than when President Trump started the process to protect our interests from the rising threats of the digital services taxes. Biden's Treasury negotiators were either asleep at the wheel or actively undermining U.S. companies, which will result in our tax dollars and jobs being sent overseas. Either way, this result is unacceptable. In the coming months, Treasury must do everything in its power to mitigate the damage that they've caused at the OECD. The whole point of these negotiations was to protect U.S. companies from the digital service taxes, but France, Canada, and other countries have already moved forward, and the OECD process is unlikely to solve this issue. As President Trump once wrote in The Art of the Deal, the worst thing you can possibly do in a deal is to seem desperate to make it. This makes the other guy smell blood, and then you're dead. I urge President Biden to heed the advice of his predecessor and hopefully successor. Mr. Bunn, can you go into further detail on why the U.S. is negotiating at the OECD on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 in the first place?
Thank you for the question. I think a little bit of the history of this is going to, I think, shed light on where we've come relative to where we were a few years ago. So after the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, other countries looked at our policies like GILTI and said, well, maybe there can be a global agreement based off of this newly designed U.S. tax tool. We could call that a global minimum tax. And at the same time, with the digital services taxes that were being adopted, it looked like a decent path forward would be multilateral negotiation to eliminate those. Back in 2019, Secretary Mnuchin sent a letter to the OECD that outlined concerns with the direction for Pillar 1 and suggested that maybe this should be an optional route for companies. And in my view, this is my interpretation of the letter, is that if there was going to be a new multilateral agreement on allocating taxing rights, that the design of that should be attractive enough with certainty and stability and things of that companies may want to opt into that. And then separately, the position of the Trump administration was to look at what was being negotiated on the global minimum tax and say, other countries, you're welcome to do that, but as long as it doesn't implicate U.S. law and require U.S. law change. Where we are today is as we talk about Amount B, there are countries that are looking at Amount B and saying, well, we might want that to be optional. And on the global minimum tax side, the agreement has already eroded part of the U.S. tax base on GILTI. So that's where we've come from, or the journey we've been on over the last several years with these negotiations. And it's not clear that there's an opportunity to move back to that previous negotiating position.
It's a shame. Mr. Minor, can you explain how the current definition of digital services taxes in Pillar 1 fail to meet the moment? And how could these definitions be improved in further negotiations to protect U.S. interests?
Yeah, so under the current language, there is some there is some flexibility that an aggressive jurisdiction can simply see how the DST is defined and then draft its version of what I would then call DST that does not fall within the forbidden elements of the DST prohibited under the current draft of the MLC. There's also an interesting exception for policy for imposing a DST in the current MLC, which looks like more of a political provision than, you know, a technical provision. And we've called for, there must be a more airtight version of the definition of DST to keep jurisdictions, prevent jurisdictions from being tempted to plan around what definition is in the MLC now.
Okay, one more quick question. Would Pillar 1 be an easier way to comply with in its current form, or would it make matters worse?
Well, it's still being amended, and so it's difficult to come to that conclusion until we've seen the final text of the MLC.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.